Welcome to day 27, Job chapter 30 through 31 of the One Year Chronological Reading Insights video. And in chapter 30 and 31, it's continuing on from 29's. He's addressing God, and in 29, he'd addressed God in relation to longing for the old days. Mostly he wanted the God of the old days, not just the goodies. In chapter 30, he addresses God, but he laments basically the present misery of his present suffering. And some of the misery is some of the mockers. So you have in verses 1 through 8. So you see verses 1 through 8. He laments the character of the mockers. Now, he'd already spoken to his three friends, so this actually is kind of a wider audience he's talking about when he talks about the kind of the character of the mockers, some of the mockers. Remember, he was a man of dignity at the gates, and now everybody kind of turns their head at him. You look in verse 1, he says this, but now, remember, he's talking to God, and he's lamenting the misery of his sufferings in relation to the first 15 verses, the mockery. We're looking at the mockery of the character of these mockers who mock him. He says, now, these mockers, they laugh at me. Men who are younger than I. That's usually not something that happens in Eastern culture. Usually there's a lot of respect for the older men, but the younger are even disrespecting him. He said, these younger men who are even disrespecting me, who laugh at me, who are mocking me, whose fathers I would have disdained to set with dogs of my flock. He just said these men, their fathers were even bad men. I wouldn't even let them hang out with the dogs of my flock. What could I gain from the strength of their hands? These young men, their hands. Usually young men have great hands, but not these. These men are lazy. Mockers, the character of these mockers, they're lazy men. Lazy young men. These men whose vigor is gone. Already these young men's vigor is gone because they don't really work hard. Through want and hard hunger, they gnaw the dry ground by night in waste and desolation. He's talking about the laziness of their character. The laziness of their character, and these are the very ones laughing and mocking at him and all his calamity, assuming that this once wise Job, who was respected and everybody wanted to hear what he had to say, he's now been judged by God, and he was a hypocrite the whole time. That's what these mockers are thinking, the character of these mockers. They pick saltwort, which is kind of like lettuce, kind of like salad, and the leaves of bushes, and the roots of the broom tree for their food. So these mockers are so lazy that they're kind of just really kind of eating off the ground, eating salad, eating stuff that's not really that yummy. They are driven out from human company. Not even regular human company wants to be around them. They shout after them as after a thief. Even in common culture, they're just treated as thieves. They're lazy. They're no goods. These are the kind of guys that are mocking him. Right, this is kind of hard for him to go from such extreme respect to now to extreme mockery. In the gullies of the torrents, they must dwell in the holes of the earth and the rocks. So these are the lowest of the low, and they're even mocking him, the character of these mockers. He's lamenting, like, these are the kind of guys that are making fun of me, that are mocking me. And verse 7, among the bushes they bray. Under the nettles, they huddle together, so they kind of don't have any place. They got no place to live. A senseless and nameless brood, they have been wiped out of the land. And now, if you don't have a place or land, that's a sign of being of not having a lot of esteem in culture. He says in verse 9, and now I have become their song. I am a byword to them. Now he says they kind of use me as kind of someone who's worse off than them, judged by them, and someone who, more than likely in his righteous judgment at the gates, Job probably had some pretty disparaging word for these mockers. He wanted them to work, to be productive in society. And even if, and more than likely, he might have made some righteous judgments against how some of these very mockers may have been treating the vulnerable in their culture, like the widows and the fatherless. He says, "I'm a byword to them." Basically, I'm basically like I'm a vulgar word. I'm a vulgar word to them. So, that's just the character of these mockers. Then it says in verse 10, they abhor me. Now, when we move to verse 10, he now talks about the substance of these mockers. He's lamenting where God has put him, even now how he's being looked. They abhor me. They keep aloof from me. They do not hesitate to spit at the sight of me. What contempt you have for somebody if you spit on them. What an ultimate sign of contempt. Because God has loosed my cord and God has humbled me. Loosing a cord means like you've been cut loose from everybody that they could tell in culture. Like God had cut Job loose when they loose from his grace when the general culture saw what had happened to him and humbled me. He says, they have cast off restraints in my presence. These mockers, I mean, they say whatever they want to. They have whatever restraint they had in the past, they've cast that off now. On my right hand, the rabble rise. They push away my feet. They cast upon against me their ways of destruction. They break up my path. They promote my calamity. They promote my calamity. Like they promote it. They talk about it. They joy in it. They need no one to help them. As though a wide breach, they come. Amid the crashing, they roll on. Terrors are turned upon me. My honor is pursued by the wind, and my prosperity has passed away like a cloud. So these are the mockers, the substance of the mockers, what's going on to Job. He's lamenting to God about it. And what's really hard with all these mockers, let's go to verse 16. When we get to verse 16, what's really hard about all this, kind of mocking is basically in verses 16 through 23, they're mocking, and yet he hears God's silence. But God's silence is really for the purpose of redemption. I guess I call this God's silent redemption, or the redemption of silence. God's redemption. I call it, actually in my notes here, I have God's redemptive silence. So I think that's a better way to look at it. God's, redemptive silence. Okay. Let's take a look at it. Hold on, having some technical difficulties here. Give me 1 second. Okay. So, let me make sure I'm still recording here, guys. All right, looks like it's working. Okay, so verse 16. Here's the hard part. Is God's redemptive silence. Is these mockers are mocking him, and they're false, they're wrong, their substance is bad, but yet he doesn't hear God. God doesn't defend him. All he hears is God's silence here. It's hard. Look at verse 16. And now my soul is poured out within me, he says. Days of affliction have taken hold of me. The night racks my bones. Even at night he's being bothered. The night racks my bones. And the pain that gnaws me takes no rest. With great force my garment is disfigured. It binds me about like the collar of a tunic. So he's just saying, man, I am tormented. Even inside, even at night, I have no rest. My soul is afflicted. All these what you've done to me, what my friends have said, what the mockers, like, Lord, this is quite a lot. Verse 19. Now in verse 19 was interesting. Verse 20. He says, God has cast me into the mire, and I have become like dust and ashes. So he's lamenting this, his soul it's hard, but really he's lamenting the redemptive silence of God. So all these things are happening. He's pouring out his soul. He's lamenting. Then verse 20, he talks to God. Okay. And in this chapter 29 through 31, when he's talking to God, he's, addressing God directly right here. He says, I cried to you for help and you do not answer me. All he hears is silence. I stand and you only look at me. So, he knows that God hears him. You have turned cruel to me. With the might of your hand you persecute me. You lift me up in the wind. You make me ride on it. And you toss me about in the roar of the storm. For I know that you will bring me to death and to the house appointed for all living. So, what's interesting, when you look at these 4 verses 20 through 24, what he hears is that God's kind of redemptive silence. And let's see, where did I write this? I'm sorry, I wrote up here in verse 16, but you really hear in verse 20 through 24, he's talking to God. He's like, God, you're silent here. You're just silent. I know you're here. I know you hear me. I know you're silent. And the wonder might be, that does seem kind of cruel, doesn't it? Well, here's the thing. In God's redemptive silence, that silence of God here is a point of a person going after the Lord even more. Just because you don't, there's no such thing as ultimately unanswered prayers. God answers all prayers. He just doesn't grant every prayer. But this silence, doesn't it remind you of the silence of the cross where Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus pouring out his soul, my God, have you forsaken me? The silence. That's why I call it redemptive silence, because it reminds us of redemption. It reminds us of the greater Job who bore the wrath of God in our place. But Job hears nothing back from God on this. Verse 24. Now when you get to verse 24 through 31 in this chapter, let's see. Let me give this kind of an overall thought. Yeah, what we see here in verses 24 through 30, 24 through 31. Job is lamenting to God about the mockery of injustice. And what his meaning is this. Job's like, hey, you do just, Lord. I've done all these people just, but I'm just being treated unjust in this. He's lamenting to the Lord about it. Look what he says in verse 24. Yet does not one in a heap of ruins stretch out his hand and in disaster cry for help? Like someone who's in a pile of rubble not stretch her hand out for help. Did not I weep for those whose day was hard? He's saying, I had justice I had compassion on those who were weeping in my regional position of leadership. Was not my soul grieved for the needy? But when I hoped for good, evil came. And when I waited for light, darkness came. So he says, I was a help to people who went through hard times. I was a man who was not unjust, but I can't get any justice. My inward parts are in turmoil, and never still. Days of affliction come to meet me. I go about darkened, but not by the sun. I stand up in the assembly and cry for help. I am a brother of jackals and a companion of ostriches. This is not how Job would have treated anybody else, but this is how he's being treated. My skin turns black and falls from me, and my bones burn with heat. One wonders if he's having some kind of, infection at this point. My lyre is turned to mourning, and my pipe to the voice of those who weep. So it's kind of like those, like, man, it's a mockery of injustice, Lord. The ones who, the ones I wouldn't even hire. I wouldn't even hire their fathers. These young are mocking me. There's these mocking men. They've got terrible character. And God, you're silent. There's this silence here. And this doesn't seem right. I wasn't unjust. I was helpful to those who went through hard times, which you can see consequently maybe why his friends were trying to pick off that he was oppressive in his kind of regional position and his judging kind of position. They thought maybe he had done unjust judgment. But he's like, no, Lord, I actually was good to people. I was good to the unjust. I gave them justice. I was fair to them. But what about me, Lord? Doesn't seem like I'm getting this. You can understand his lament. You can see why. Chapter 31 is the last chapter of his last pleading his case to God, pleading his innocence. Now in this chapter, Job addresses God and he's protesting his innocence over and over. He's talking about his innocence. We've got, let's see, in my notes, I see 10 different areas where he discusses really his innocence in the matter. Let's take a look at it. So this is his last time to kind of talk with the Lord on it. So Job addresses God and he's protesting. He's saying, I'm innocent. I'm innocent. Well, take a look at verses 1 through 4. He lets the Lord know and tells the Lord, like, I'm pure on the inside and on the outside. Take a look at me in here. He says, I have made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I gaze at a virgin? He just says, like, even my eyes are pure. I've made a covenant with my eyes. His eyes weren't wandering, which, by the way, if you want to know how, what's an idea of a person who's walking right with God? How do you know? What do you do with your eyes? And are you able to control your eyes? Are you able to be righteous with your eyes? As a man, are you able to be righteous in how you use your eyes as you look towards women who are made in the image of God? And, or are you able as a woman to use your eyes in a way that's not despising of others? So he's like, my eyes were righteous. He says, what would be my portion from God above and my heritage from the Almighty on high? Is not calamity for the unrighteous and disaster for the workers of iniquity? He's saying, what would be my portion? Like the Lord, I've not done any of these things. But does not he see my ways and number all my steps? He's saying, Lord, you've been seeing all my steps. You know exactly what's going on. I've made a covenant with my eyes. I am the same inside and out. You see my ways and you number my steps. Lord, you know that my outside is right. You know that my inside is right. He's like, Lord, you know all the way from the heart to the eyes to the actions. Now, when we look at verse 5 and 6, we kind of give his first thing he talks about. He says his heart has not turned aside from anything. He says, he's making his defense to God. He's lamenting. He protests his innocence with God. This is kind of his final speech, really. He's letting the Lord know that, like, I'm innocent of all these things. I'm innocent, Lord. I'm innocent. So he says, if I have walked with falsehood and my feet have hastened to deceit, let me be weighed in a just balance and let God know my integrity. So first, his heart is not turned aside from the Lord. So that's his first thing, number one. My heart is not turned aside from the Lord. His next thing about his integrity, remember, he's just trying to look through things because God's not told him specifically. He doesn't know what he's done wrong, but he wants to have a chance to kind of defend himself. In verse 7 through 8, he says, if my steps have turned aside from the way and my heart has gone after my eyes, and if any spot has stuck in my hands, then let me sow and another eat, and let what grows for me be rooted out. So he even talks about kind of God's judgment here for that. So he first says, my heart is not turned aside from you at all, Lord. Number one, my heart has not turned aside. And I probably should actually draw this, to go here. His heart has, number one, not turned aside from the Lord. Verse 9. Verse 9 through 12. Let's see if I can get more of 9 up here to the top. There we go. Verse 9 through 12. He kind of gives his second claim of innocence here. And he says, I've not turned towards adultery. I've not done it, Lord. I've not turned towards adultery. So he's trying to think through all the things of which could show a man unrighteous. So he's wanting to claim his innocence, and he's kind of reviewing through his life, which, just understand, this is actually good for all this hard time that he's going through. This is a good time for him to review his walk with the Lord. And you see how innocent he is. Now, he's not innocent of original sin, but he's a pretty innocent guy here as far as all the things that came on him in chapter 1 and 2. They weren't for discipline's sake, but they were for the glory of God. He says, if my heart had been enticed towards a woman, and I have lain in wait at my neighbor's door, then let my wife grind for another, and let others bow down to her. Yes, we are talking about like sexual things. He's basically saying, if I have committed adultery right here, if I've done it, if I've done adultery, there's no T right there, so just make that an L here. If I've done adultery, man, maybe my wife go out and cheat on me. For what? That would be a heinous crime. There would be an iniquity to be punished by the judges. For that would be a fire that consumes as far as Abaddon, and it would burn to the root of all increase. He says, if I've done adultery, then you're right. Consume everything as far as death. When you get that word Abaddon, you're really speaking to this idea of basically the place of destruction. You're thinking of hell is like, and basically, if you look at his life, that's basically what's happened. Like fire, and to the root, he's lost all his increase. So he's like, listen, if I've even committed adultery on my wife, listen, you would be right. Take away everything, punish me, do exactly what happened. Isn't that interesting? He's like, send all this on me. But he says, Lord, I'm innocent. I've not committed adultery. I've not done anything adulterous. Verse 13. He says in verse 13, and that'll be 13 through 15. His third kind of protestation of innocence is that he hasn't done any injustice towards his servants. There's been no injustice to his servants. I mean, if you had servants, he treated his servants like employees, not this kind of chattel slavery, and he was good to them. And there was no injustice in how he treated them. He could understand all this that happened to him if he had. He says, if I had rejected the cause of my manservant or maidservant when they brought up complaint against me, what then shall I do when God rises up? So he's like listen, you're totally right. What reason would I have to claim my innocence? When he makes iniquity, what shall I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make him? So he's like, listen, I've treated them with equality. I've treated them as image bearers. I haven't done anything wrong to the servants in my house. I've treated them well. And did not one fashion us in the womb? He's like, just as I'm in God's image, they're in God's image. And have I treated them wrongly, Lord? Have I done anything of that nature? No, he said, I've even treated them well, which in that culture, and a lot of cultures, there could always be a temptation to be cruel and mean to anybody in a servant status. Verse 16 through 20. We'll go here, 16 through 20. He brings his fourth claim of innocence that he has He has been generous with the needy. He has not turned his heart away from the needy. He's been generous. He says, if I've withheld anything that the poor desired, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fall. Part of his position that he stood in culture was he was a stopgap for those that were in poverty and for the widows. He says, or have I eaten my morsels alone, or the fatherless has not eaten of it? He says, for from my youth the fatherless grew up with me as with a father, and from my mother's womb I guided the widow. He's just saying, like, he's always taking care of the fatherless his whole entire life. If he ate, the fatherless ate. If I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or needy without covering, if his body has not blessed me, and if he was not warmed with the fleece of my sheep. He's saying, like, I've taken care of I've been generous to the needy, Lord. So I've not done anything in relation to my servants or adultery. My heart is not turned aside from you. I've been generous to the needy. I haven't withheld from them. I've not done cruelly to them. He says in verse 21, verse 21 through 23, he gives his fifth, and he says, like, I've not been violent. I've not been violent, especially to the vulnerable. I've not been violent to those who are easy to be violent to and can't defend themselves. He says, if I've raised my hand against the fatherless, the vulnerable, because I saw my help in the gate, then let my shoulder blade fall from off my shoulder. Basically saying, like, the muscles of my shoulder blade fall off. Basically, if this happens, then you can't raise your hand. These two are connected. So he's like, may I never be able to raise a hand again if that's what I've done. And let my arm be broken from its socket. For I was in terror of calamity from God, and I could not have faced his majesty. So he says, I've not been violent to the vulnerable. If I have, like, rip out my muscles and my arm from my arm socket so that I could no longer even raise my arm as if I would raise it to hurt somebody. So Lord, I'm righteous in this. I've not done anything. I've not been violent to a very vulnerable crowd that any angry man could take something out and there's really nothing they could do about it. Verse 24 through 25, this is his sixth one. He has not trusted wealth. He says, if I have made gold my trust, or called fine gold my confidence, if I have rejoiced because my wealth was abundant, or because my hand had found much. So he says, I've not even trusted in wealth. I've not trusted in gold. I've been rich. I've had a lot, but I didn't place any faith in that, Lord. I don't understand why this is happening to me. He's protesting before the Lord on this. He's claiming his innocence. He's lamenting and speaking his case before the Almighty. Verse 26 through 28. He talks about the seventh evidence of his innocence. He has not worshipped false gods, particularly the sun and the moon. He says, if I've looked at the sun when it shone, or the moon moving in splendor, and in that day, and in a lot of astrology kind of religions, there's a worship of planets and stars, the sun and the moon. And he says, like, I've not done that. It's everybody else has. I've not done that. He says, my heart has been secretly enticed, and my mouth had kissed my hand. He's like, I haven't basically blown kisses. That's what he's saying. I haven't blown kisses at these false gods of the sun and the moon. This also would be an iniquity to be punished by the judges, for I would have been false to God above. So he's like, listen, this would have been okay. All the judgment I have received from you, all the calamity, I would have been okay with it. If I had worshiped false gods, I would have gotten what I deserve. I'm innocent though, Lord. I'm innocent. I want to plead my case to you for this. verse 29 through 30. He gives number 8. His number 8, lamenting his innocence before the Lord. He did not celebrate when his enemies were ruined. You know, if something bad happens to an enemy, you don't do it, but someone else does, or something else happens, almost like there's a secret. Kind of, I'm glad they got theirs. He says, I have not even done that. He says, and if I have rejoiced at the ruin of him who hated me, or exulted when evil overtook him, I have not let my mouth sin by asking for his life with a curse. If the men of my tent had not said, who is there that has not been filled with his meat? Oh, I'm sorry. I went into verse 31. Sorry. So he's just saying, I haven't celebrated when my enemies were ruined. Now we'll go to verse 31. Verse 31 through 32. This is number 9, and he basically says, I've been hospitable. Like, I've not denied hospitality. He says, if the men of my tent had not said, who is there that has not been filled with his meat? It's like basically saying, like, everybody gets filled with meat. All the guests and visitors, I'm hospitable. If someone hasn't, it's because the men of my tent didn't tell me. If they've told me, then I've made sure. He says, the sojourner has not lodged in the street. I have opened my doors to the traveler. I've been hospitable. Lord, I want to protest my innocence here. I want to lament my innocence here before you. Verse 33. This is number 10, and really you could say this is the last one. His kind of claiming his innocence in verse 33 through 34. Number 10, he basically says, he has not hidden his sin. I've not hidden my sin, Lord. If I have concealed my transgression as others do, by hiding my iniquity in my bosom, because I stood in greater fear of the multitude, and contempt of families terrified me, so that I kept silence and did not go out the doors. So he says, I didn't do that. I didn't try to hide my sin for fear of what the multitude would say, or because I was embarrassed to experience the contempt of other families. I've not hid my sin. I've not tried to hide it in my bosom. I've not hid my sin, Lord. So I want to protest my innocence. Now remember, he's not claiming he's sinless. He's just claiming that what has happened to him, the calamity, there's no connection to anything that he can see in his life, although everybody else, even his friends, are convinced he must have had all sorts of heinousness in his life, because that's the only way God works. God works a very simple system of cause and effect, and it happens in exact real time. There's no nuances to the sovereignty of God. So Job has made his protest to the Lord. He's about to put it down, but we still have a couple more verses. Verse 35 through 37. Was interesting. He basically wants the indictment sheet declared, so he knows what he needs to defend. That's what he kind of wants in verses 35 through 37. He basically wants the indictment. He wants the indictment sheet. He wants the indictment sheet against him, so he can know what he has done. He wants it. He says, oh, that I had one to hear me. Hear me, Lord. This is my signature. He's basically saying, this is it. I've got nothing else to say, Lord. I got no more defense to myself. I'm done. I've told you. Let the Almighty answer me now. Oh, that I had the indictment written by my adversary. He's like, I want to know what's the guilt sheet? What's the sheet? What's the rap sheet on me? I don't know. I've just told you 10 things, Lord. I don't know. What is it, Lord? Tell me. My adversary. Interesting. It seems like the Lord might be, from Job's perspective, he doesn't know all that's going on. All he can tell is the Lord looks like the Lord's his adversary. And not true. Our real adversary is Satan, but, you kind of understand he's lamenting where he's at. Surely I would carry it on my shoulder. He said, if I had this indictment sheet, this sheet that could tell me all that I've done wrong, surely I would carry it on my shoulder and I would bind it on me as a crown. It's like I put it around basically I put it around my neck, this indictment sheet, I put it on my head. I would give him an account of all my steps like a prince. I would approach him. So he says, I wish I had this indictment sheet, because if I did, I'd put it around my neck and I'd put it on my head and I would give him account of all my steps. I would at least be able to know, what am I defending myself about? Job rattles off 10 things here, and he's not really, he's just trying to pick out, like, what could it be? What could my indictment be? And he lists 10 areas of innocence that would tend to be kind of the big things. And he says, I'm laying my pen down here, Lord. I don't know, but I'd love to have an indictment sheet that would just tell me. Then we end Job basically says here, he says, basically, if I'm guilty, my land knows it. So he's basically saying, ask my land. It sees everything. It would tell you if I was guilty. If my land has cried out against me and its furrows have wept together, it's not like, literally his land would be telling off on him, but he's like, the land sees everything. Land, God's creation sees everything. So if the rocks could talk, if the sheetrock could talk, if the dirt could talk, if the trees could talk, if my land has cried out against me and its furrows have wept together, if I have eaten its yield without payment and made its owners breathe their last. So he's like, if I've treated those who work the land bad, my land, let thorns grow instead of wheat and foul weeds instead of barley. And the words of Job were ended. So now he's done. He's done defending himself before God, his innocence before God. He's saying even creation would cry out and see it and say it if I was guilty. So now we've reached the end of Job's account of him defending himself for God, talking to God, chapter 29, 30, and 31. Now it's interesting. We see in this, you see in this the Savior. You see that here's a man who is pointing to the greater Job, Jesus, who is innocent, as Job is innocent here. And that all creation can testify to the innocence of Jesus, not sullied by sin. Jesus never turned himself towards sin. He was completely innocent. He made right what Adam did wrong. And Jesus did have an indictment on him. The indictment of man's sin was on Jesus. But like Job says, I want this indictment so that I can prove my innocence. Jesus took our guilty indictment on himself and then offered his righteous life in place of our account so that we could be declared righteous before God. What a praise to his name. I hope that you can see the gospel message in Job. I hope that as if you've been following along, you can see how the pain of this moment also still points us towards the Savior. Well, this is the end of Job 30 through 31 in our 1 year chronological reading, and we will see you tomorrow.